Well, hi everyone. Thanks for coming. 6:30, we're going to get started. We've got our program Connecticut in the Great War. We've got Christine Pittsley here. She's going to tell us about World War I. She's really excited to talk to us about it. It's apparently her favorite time period. So we're thrilled to have her here. This is part of our Celebrating America's 250th Anniversary program. So we've got one more coming up at the end of February on Connecticut World War I monuments. And that's going to focus on our Doughboy statue, of course, but also on monuments in Connecticut celebrating World War I. And then two on the progressive period in March with a Barnum presentation and women's suffrage. Then two on the Civil War, two on westward expansion, and then in June, two on the Revolutionary War. So I hope you guys continue to come and enjoy them. And so with that, Christine.
Thank you. As you said, I'm Christine Pittsley. I am the Military and Special Projects Curator at the Museum of Connecticut History, which is right across the street from the state capitol within the State Library. I've been there for 18 years, and my first 15 years there were on the library side working for the Office of the State Librarian. So I got to do all this fun World War I stuff during the centenary back in 2017, 2018. So I actually ran the state's commemorative activities. So we'll talk a little bit about some of those. And I got sucked in by World War I, and I am completely addicted. And I'm so excited to give this program because I haven't given this in a while. I've been doing a lot of Rev War stuff, and this is just like, yay. So the great thing about World War I is it's overlooked. How many of you remember learning about it in school? How did you spend any more than a day on it? Did you spend lots of time on World War II though? So the thing is, and we talked to teachers about this, you can't have World War II without World War I. And just like in the American Revolution, Connecticut was really important in World War I. And as I was reacquainting myself with this presentation tonight, I realized just how many parallels there are between the American Revolution and World War I. We are creating an exhibit at the museum that's going to open on July 4th. It's a statewide exhibit. And we talk a lot about the provision state, Connecticut being the provision state. And as I was doing this, I realized just what a straight line it is from the American Revolution and the foresight that a lot of the men in Connecticut had to, get extra blankets because they knew that George Washington was going to need blankets for the troops. So they had women in Connecticut making blankets. So when it came time, hey, here's all the blankets you need. We did the same thing in World War I. So we'll get into that a little bit. I'm also a Francophile, so that's another great connection we have between the Revolution and World War I. Without further ado, can we get rid of that top bar? The meeting being recorded, sorry. This is the guy who started it all. This is George Seymour Goddard. He was the state librarian from 1900 to 1936. And he was so important when he died in 1936, he laid in state in the museum. He was quoted in the Hartford Courant at the beginning of the war saying, if only our forefathers had recorded everything that had happened during Civil War, if they had only kept all of the material, imagine what we would know. So he decided to do that for World War I. And this is one of my favorite quotes. We of today know how these new opportunities and these new responsibilities have been met in Connecticut, but we want those who shall come after us, our children and their grandchildren, to know what Connecticut has done. We want them to know that when this great conflict came, Connecticut was the first state in the Union to begin to get ready and to pledge, through ex-Governor Holcomb, our war governor, its support to our government for the protection of liberty. How well this pledge has been fulfilled, we of today know, in order that those tomorrow may know, and thus be inspired and encouraged to do their duty in their day. There is being assembled in connection with the military order of foreign wars of the state of Connecticut in the Department of War Records at our state library for the benefit of the people and historians of tomorrow, not only the histories of divisions and regiments, but also of individuals who served at the front and the histories of the activities of towns, societies, and communities who supported those at the front through the various industries at home. As the former state librarian Ken Wiggin used to say, George was just a hoarder. We have one of the largest World War I collections in the country at our library. It's mostly state stuff, but it is representative of how the war proceeded throughout the country. Part of that was because of the preparedness movement. This was a movement that started really in 1915 with Theodore Roosevelt, Leonard Wood, who was the former chief of staff of the Army, Elihu Root, and Henry Stimson, who were former secretaries of war. They believed that the United States needed to be ready to go to war. They knew that war was coming. They knew that the United States couldn't keep out of this war. So they urged people to be prepared. They created what was called the Plattsburgh Camp. This was a camp held in the summer of 1915 and 1916 in Plattsburgh, New York, to train military officers. These were mostly well-to-do, college-educated men. And Connecticut sent a ton of men to Plattsburgh. Connecticut also had a really strong National Guard. We were very well formed, we were very well trained, and that kind of contributed to the whole Connecticut being ready for preparedness. The country had been coming out of a recession, and most of the country was getting back on their feet. Connecticut was booming. No, not on this slide. Our economy was humming along because of our manufacturing industry. Our gun makers, our ammunition makers, our brass makers, they were all supplying the Allies with shells and ammunition and everything else that they could create. So we were doing really well. The rest of the country in 1915, the most popular song was "I Didn't Raise My Boy to Be a Soldier." In Connecticut, it wasn't that popular. We were, for the most part, really attached to preparedness. When the Lusitania was sunk in May of 1915, there were a lot of people that said, okay, now the United States is going to get in, and that kind of cemented, yes, we're going to get into this. It also happened that in the hull of the Lusitania, our other connection to that, besides the people, in the hull of the Lusitania were 4.2 million .303 rifle cartridges made by Remington in Bridgeport. Hence why the Lusitania was, targeted. So during the 15 and 16, there were all sorts of preparedness parades held here in the state. People got really excited about being ready. That's not to say everyone was. There were socialists. We had a really strong labor contingent here in Connecticut, so there were a lot of labor disputes because of those factories. And there was a lot of growth. Bridgeport tripled in size in a year, and there were housing shortages in all of the major cities because the factories grew faster than the housing could. So we had more people working in the factories than we could house. In June of 1916, there were some, actually March of 1916, we went down into Mexico to go after the Mexican rebel, yes, Pancho Villa. I couldn't think of what I wanted to call him. After his men killed four Americans in Columbus, New Mexico, President Wilson mobilized the National Guard units. And Connecticut sent, I think it was about 3,000 troops down to Nogales, Arizona, where they spent July to October marching, not getting paid, drinking near beer because, beer was not legal in Arizona at the time, and then marching more and writing about snakes and being bored and marching. But they got really, really well prepared. Coming out of they were one of the most trained National Guard units that served on the border. And coming out of this, they were ready for what they were going to face in World War I. And I think our leaders knew that. So the other big thing that Connecticut did was the manpower census of 1917. On February 7th, Governor Holcomb said, we're going to do this manpower census. We are going to enumerate every man over the age of 16 so that we know who we've got. We know who we can let go for the draft. So that was kind of what the public was told. In private, behind the scenes, one of the reasons for this was to protect our munitions industry. We needed to know who was working in those factories so we could protect them when the draft came. Because we knew there was going to be a draft. America did not have a large enough standing army to go to war. There had to be a draft. So the leaders in the country said, you know what? We need to protect them. So they did this census. They registered 502,000 men. We have 442,000 of these forms digitized. I don't know what happened to the other 60,000. They're probably somewhere. It took 888,000 square feet of paper, 1.5 million filing cards. It was completed in less than 2 months at a cost of $24,000. That's about $600,000 today.
How long did it take to scan all of that?
We didn't do it. Family Search did it for us. So it was actually, they were on microfilm and then they were scanned from the microfilm. But so this is one, a man from here in Bethel. So it asks, whoops, let's see, there we go. Every town had its own code. So these red pencil marks were used to classify information. You've got his name, the town, trade or occupation. He was a hatter, so each occupation had a code. His age, height, weight, have you served? Do you have any dependents? And then it asks about prior service. So he spent 8 months as a musician in the Connecticut Guard, so he was probably down in Mexico. And then it asks these really fun things like, can you ride a horse? Can you handle a team, drive an automobile, ride a motorcycle? Because they wanted to know really what people could be used for. So let's see, whoops. One of the other things that happened with this census, because every nationality, you see there, are you a citizen of the United States? Yes, and there's a red one. This gentleman, also from Bethel, was from Germany, which was considered an enemy country. So he gets a 17. When they enumerated all of this stuff, they also made lists. They made lists of just the men by age, but they made enemy alien lists that could be used to watch Germans and Austrians, and a few other nationalities that they threw in there for good measure. But every nationality ended up on a list. And there are reports that they were used at times. So this one is my favorite. It is not Bethel related. This is William Howard Taft. He was teaching at Yale at the time. And the best part of this one is right here when he says, can you ride a horse? He said, yes, but hard on the horse. I found that, I was like, oh my God, this is the best. So this is a room at the State Library. When this was completed, all of those forms were moved to the State Library, and this whole floor of the State Library became a militarized zone. You could not get in there if you didn't have authorization, and they would not answer any questions if you tried to ask anybody about any of it. The machines on the right are Hollerith machines. They took all of those forms and they put them on punch cards. They coded them onto punch cards. And the insurance companies loaned these holograph machines to the state library to tabulate all of this information. So this is George Goddard here, kind of checking on the work. These are the file cabinets that we still have upstairs in our attic today, full of the holograph cards. So if we wanted to find those 60,000, we could probably reverse tabulate all of these cards, but that would cost a little too much. So because of this census, states around the country were calling Governor Holcomb to say, how did you do this? We want to do this. And Teddy Roosevelt said, I feel that every decent American in this country is under a heavy debt of obligation to Governor Holcomb and the people of Connecticut for what the state has done. It was a remarkable thing to get done. It was done by volunteers. And so all of the work that was done in February and March of 1917 came really into focus after April 6th of 1917 when war was declared. Because that's when the government decided, oh yeah, we don't have enough men for this army. We're going to have a draft. And it was the men who ran the draft here in Connecticut, or ran this census here in Connecticut, that were down in Washington talking to the boards about how we did this. And if you look at how the draft was rolled out on June 5th of 1917, which was the first draft registration day, it looks pretty much like what we did here in Connecticut in February and March of 17. So we also, that was so successful, we did a nursing survey. We did a transportation census, so we could figure out who had cars or trucks that the government might, take, who had boats. And there were a lot of boats that were commandeered by the government to do river patrols and coastal patrols, because the fear was Germans would come up the Connecticut River and sabotage the Colt factory, which was right on the river. There was an agricultural census that looked at what were we growing, how much were we growing, who was doing the field work, and what more could we produce for the war effort. This nursing census, there were 2 of them done, looked at the nurses in the state who were trained. What kind of skills did you have? Were you willing, let's see, down here, would you volunteer for an emergency call overseas? A lot of them said yes, a lot of women said no. And we did have a lot of women go over. I couldn't find any from Bethel, but that's not to say there weren't Bethel women that went, just not no one who did the nursing survey. And then we also did an industrial census to look at what factories were making and how they could be retooled if they weren't already producing for the war, how they could be retooled to produce things for the war. So this is the George A. Shepard and Sons Company here in Bethel. And you can see right over here, it's asking for the percentage of output for the US government. And it says have just commenced on government order. This also, they had to report on how much coal they used because there was a coal shortage. So there were rations for coal, and the coal would go to the factories that were making things for the war. So these guys were making sweat leather for army and civilian use, and something fancy leather for various uses. Sorry? Yeah, so, that Bethel wasn't a huge manufacturing town. There were only 4 industrial census done for Bethel. But you get into places like Bridgeport, and my favorite, there's one in the Connecticut Macaroni Company in New Haven. They weren't making anything for the war, but they were very eager to if the War Department would have them. So in Connecticut, we made everything. In 1918 alone, Bridgeport produced 2 billion 30-06 shells and 1.2 billion rounds of other small arms ammunition. It's said that 50% of the small arms ammunition in France was produced here in Connecticut. And having been there and having gone to the battlefields, I found Connecticut-made ammunition, and there is just so much still in the ground. Waterbury and the Brass Valley was producing the brass for the shells. Colt was producing firearms. Glastonbury Knitwear was producing underwear. Russell Manufacturing in Middletown was making web belting. Everyone was making something. So in 1918, to kind of show off what we were doing at the Connecticut State Fair, they did this whole Connecticut war exhibits in the exhibition hall. And it was very popular. So they kind of put on display all of the things that were being made here. There was a model of a Zeppelin, which somehow got lost after this exhibition, and they were worried that the Germans had, there was worry that the Germans had somehow stolen it. So in the midst of all of that manufacturing, there was so much more going on here at home. This is an Americanization hut. These kind of popped up all over the place to help immigrants learn English so they could serve in the army or they could, you know, become Americans at the time. There were Liberty Loan cottages. There were rallies. This is a rally that was held outside of Pratt and Whitney in Hartford. And this one was for Liberty Loans. That's how we funded the war. We had 5 Liberty Loan drives over 3 years. And it got to the point, if you didn't buy a Liberty Loan, you were a slacker. Same with, if you didn't register for that military census that we did, the legislature created a penalty. You could be fined $500 and spend 30 days in jail if you refused to participate. And there were teachers that would go to their class and say, has your brother registered? Has your father registered? And the pressure and the peer pressure, the shame that came along with not registering, with not participating, was really, really strong. We don't live in a society like that today, so we can't imagine, but you had to buy a Liberty Loan. You had to buy war savings stamps. If you didn't, your neighbors knew and you were shamed. So, and people lined up to buy them. We had exhibitions. This was a British tank that remodeled Pope Park in Hartford. There were spectators. There were like 100,000 spectators to see this tank. They set up obstacle courses. You can see there, this one's crushing a car. And again, this was a rally to raise support and raise money for the war effort. And women played such a huge part. This is a Liberty Loan cottage that stood in front of the old State House. There's still a Liberty Loan cottage in Waterbury. It's over by the mall in the little parklet, kind of, I can't remember the road that goes off to Seven Angels. It is there. It's been there since World War I. They recently, I think it was the Waterbury VFW or American Legion a couple of years ago, restored it. These were everywhere. Every town had something similar, a place to do the Liberty Loan campaigns from, to do war work from. People were collecting clothing for the refugees, and, you know, the French children were being adopted, you know, kind of like we adopt what's that children's program that used to be infomercials? They help, yeah. They did the same thing with French orphans and would send money over. This was at Hill's department store in Hartford. Window displays like this were everywhere. And come in May of 1918, there was a Red Cross parade. And so the windows were all full of all the Red Cross gear that you might need. Patriotism was everywhere. You could not escape the war. Even though it wasn't being fought here, everyone was being asked to sacrifice. And that's something we don't do as a country anymore. So it's a little hard to imagine what it was like, but everyone had to sacrifice. We didn't ration like we did in World War II, but it wasn't easy for people either. This is one of my favorite women. This is Mrs. Mary Hart. She was the first railroad crossing guard in Hartford. And she had basically told a reporter that came up to her that she would bop her boss on the nose if he took her, or bop a man on the nose if he took her stop sign away one more time, because men were coming up and taking her stop sign because they didn't feel that she should be working there. This was the point where women started working in the factories. Women started taking the place of the men that were off to war. We think about that in terms of World War II. We know that happened, but it happened in World War I as well. Hartford Rubber Works, where they were making gas masks and parts of gas masks, became where the society girls went to work. We've got articles about society girls competing to get into Hartford Rubber Works for a job. This is from the inside of the Liberty Loan Cottage, and this was one of any number of events that women ran to raise funds, to raise awareness, to roll bandages. Women also learned how to drive and repair ambulances, which was another big shocker. Women were not supposed to be doing that kind of thing, but they did, and they kicked butt. So this is at the Connecticut State Fair. This is some of the war work at the State Library. This again was just the women cataloging all of the stuff that we were collecting. And then there were ethnic Liberty Loan committees. So this is the Italian Liberty Loan Committee, I think. I can't remember which. I've got about 1,000 photos of like this: Italian, Greek, Polish, you name it, there were Liberty Loan committees. Every company had a Liberty Loan committee, and they were the ones going out and trying to raise money from their fellow employees. Aetna became the first to do Liberty Loans on a subscription basis. Aetna would take money out of your check to pay towards a larger Liberty bond. So Aetna had such success with it, they rolled it out to companies across the state. So if Shepherd Company wanted to take part, Aetna would pay for the Liberty loans, and then Shepherd Company would take the money out of their employees and pay Aetna. It was really ingenious, and it helped Connecticut oversubscribe to every Liberty loan. Every loan had a quota. Every state had to earn so much. And Connecticut, every time, even during the fourth Liberty loan, which was October of 1918, when the Spanish flu was raging, even then Connecticut oversubscribed. And then the Hello Girls. Anybody ever heard of the Hello Girls? The Hello Girls were bilingual switchboard operators who were trained, and they went and worked pretty much on the front lines in France. They were the ones communicating orders between the French army and the American army. So they had to be fluent in both English and French. A movie was made not that long ago, and Congress just officially recognized their service a few years ago. They were part of the army. They served. They wore uniforms. They were trained. And then when the war ended, they were let go, not discharged. So not a lot was known. Nobody really paid attention until the 70s, when some of the women started saying, hey, you know, I deserve a pension too. Congress officially recognized them a few years ago. This is a group of Hello Girls that trained in Hartford, which was not something most people knew about. Even the woman who wrote the book on the Hello Girls wasn't aware. So I wonder how many other cities had training programs that just kind of nobody ever looked. Whoops. So, as I mentioned before, the Connecticut National Guard was one of the most well-organized in the state. In early 17, before we even got into the war, they were heavily recruiting. They were going out into towns across the state, setting up encampments and saying, hey, you know, you want to come and enlist for us before you get drafted into some other bad unit. That was good and bad. You generally enlisted with the guys that you knew. So in the case of one particular battle, which I'll talk about in a little while, a whole bunch of guys enlisted together from New Haven, and they went off to war together, and they all died together on the same day. So it had its ups and downs. It was the same thing in Britain. Entire units were wiped out, entire villages were wiped out because everybody signed up together. Connecticut did the same thing, and that's why everything changed for World War II. You didn't have that sort of National Guard structure. So there were camps everywhere. This one is in New Haven. Yale Field became a huge encampment in the summer of 1917. And that's where all of the National Guard troops kind of converged to train and get ready to deploy. Most of the National Guardsmen here in Bethel ended up in what was called the Coast Artillery Corps. There was the 102nd, which was more of an infantry unit, and then the Coast Artillery. So most of the guys in the National Guard were Coast Artillery. They still saw battle. They just weren't up in the front lines in most of the battles like the guys in the 102nd were. We also had the draftees. This was a picture from Hartford on June 5th of 1917, which I mentioned was the first draft registration day. This is where selective service comes from, this day right here. And they ran out of space at the draft halls where they were doing this. So they enlisted some out of service trolleys to use as registration places. So if any of you ever done genealogy, you've seen the draft card, those World War I draft cards, that's what was happening this day. So most of the draftees ended up in what we call the National Army. The Army was kind of split into three ways. There was the regular Army. Those are the guys that enlisted in the Army of their own accord. There was the National Guard, which are the guys that enlisted in the National Guard and were federalized. And then there was the National Army, which were all the draftees. Those were the guys who didn't really want to go, but stepped up when it came time. This is at the Hall of Records. This is a draft class from some district in Hartford. And we have a ton of these photos in our collections, and most towns have photos of their draftees going off to war. Parades. There were tons of parades to see the guys off. And this was the scene at the train station in Hartford to see off the first group of draftees. So that was all the stuff happening here. And there was, I mean, I could go on and on about this stuff. Kids were involved. There were pig clubs where kids were given pigs to raise. And the boy and the girl who raised the biggest pig got a $50 Liberty loan or Liberty bond. There were cooking classes. There was Boy Scouts out doing their own Liberty loan stuff. Everyone was involved. There were knitting bees to knit sweaters and gloves and hats for the soldiers. You really could not get away from it. It also meant that you knew someone that was serving. You knew somebody that was going over there, which included ladies. I knew that there were women, and I knew that the Salvation Army was over there. But this one was really fun because this woman right there, her name is Myrtle Turkington, best name ever. And she was from Manchester, Connecticut. So this picture was taken in April of 1918 in a town called Ansalvi, which was about 3 miles behind the front lines. And on those front lines were Connecticut troops. So we've actually found some letters from Connecticut men saying, I went to the Salvation Army hut and I saw a girl from back home. It was so nice to see her. So these ladies would make donuts and pies and coffee They would have sing-alongs. They would provide writing materials to the soldiers. This was like heaven on earth after you'd been in the front lines. And this is another one. So this is Myrtle right here, making their pies. So during the commemoration period, there were a lot of reenactments, and I work with a group that has a rolling kitchen. It's a model of what was actually used. They built it themselves, and you can actually cook on it. And so I have one of these dresses, and I have put my helmet on and my gas mask and make donuts. And it's a lot of work. And they were making so many. They were up all hours. So it was at this place in Onseville on April 20th, which I'll talk about in a little while, they were actually bombed. So even though they were behind the front lines, they were still on the front lines. They were still seeing what was happening. They just weren't in a combat role. So that takes me to our Connecticut guys. This is a place that is near and dear to my heart, and this is where Herbert Hopkins, who was a Bethel soldier who joined the 102nd Infantry Regiment, which is Connecticut National Guard, was part of the 26th Division, which were all the New England troops called the Yankee Division. In February and March of 1918, they had gone through training over the winter down in the Vosges area, and then they came up here to the Chemin de Dame, which is the Road of Ladies. It was a ridge line that the Germans and French had been fighting over since the beginning of the war. The Germans pretty much occupied it up until October of 1917, when the French took it over, and they held this line while we were there. Connecticut troops, the National Guard troops, or the Yankee Division troops, are the only American troops to ever spend time at Froidmont or along the Chemin de Dame. Froidmont is an underground city. This is the ladder, the first ladder you have to climb to get down into the quarry. There are two of them. And it's a time capsule down there. There's this newspaper that's still there. This quarry held 10,000 men. It had electricity, there were maps, and it was so far below ground that you were safe from the bombings. These are old limestone quarries that had been used to build cathedrals in France, and now held things like cans of food. One of the last times I was in there, we kind of dug through this area that had collapsed and pulled out all of these cans of food. So this is where Herbert Hopkins lived for 2 months. The guys of the Yankee Division wrote their names. They carved their names. They used the candle smoke to write their names on the ceilings of these quarries. And he was Company K. So these are literally the caves he was in. And you can see they carved sometimes. This is on the right are piles of shoes. This is probably where the cobbler was, and would repair shoes. There were kitchens down there. I mean, it was a living, breathing city. A couple of years ago, we took the 2nd Governor's Horse Guard out of Newtown with us. We took 5 of them on a battlefield tour. This whole wall is Connecticut men from what had been, it was the 101st Machine Gun or 102nd Machine Gun Battalion, which had actually been the 2nd Governor's Horse Guard. When they were federalized, they became this battalion. So these guys on the wall are all members of, or were members of the 2nd Governor's Horse Guard. So this was really emotional for these guys. I've been down there with family members whose grandfathers have their names on the wall. And it's just, and Gilles Chalon, the gentleman who takes care of it, raised money to put this outside of the entrance. It is in memory of the 26th U.S. Division, the Yankee Division. He loves to have visitors. I've been down there 6 or 7 times. I can't go to France without it. If you ever go to France and you'd like to visit, please let me know. It is, you can't explain it until you've been down there. So the other big battle I mentioned was Seicheprey. This is the one that marked Connecticut. I've studied a war artist named Harry Everett Thompson. Oh my goodness. I cannot think of his name right now. He was one of the sanctioned war artists, and in his diary, he wrote about Seicheprey. There are rumors I've heard from French historians that when the Marines went into battle at Belleau Wood, they said, this is for Seicheprey. Seicheprey was the first German offensive against American troops. It was considered a skirmish by Pershing. Pershing famously did not like General Edwards, the commander of the 26th Division. But it was this little place here. This is called Montsec, and the Germans held that. And the rest of this is the Woof Plain. So you can see everything from up there. In the end of March, Connecticut troops took over the town of Seicheprey, and we took it from the 1st Division or 2nd Division, and we were to hold the lines. We were out in the front lines, which are called sacrifice trenches. Our numbers were low. There should have been 250 men to a company, and there were maybe 200 in a company, sometimes less. And it was a muddy, wet place. It had been the front line since 1914, but it had been quiet since 1914. On the night of April 20th, actually 3 o'clock in the morning on April 20th, Company C and D were in the front lines in those sacrifice trenches. And the rest of the National Guard, I'm not going to go into perfect disposition, were stationed on either flank, and the French were on the right flank. And at 3 in the morning, a box barrage began. And that means the Germans basically fired a box around Seicheprey so that nothing could get in or out, effectively cutting off all lines of communication. They overran those front lines, and there was about 3,500 Germans against 600 Americans. And among those were 1,200 stormtroopers. Those were the shock troops. Those were the really seasoned, like hardcore, the scary guys that the Germans kind of held back until they were really needed. And they sent them out here to teach these green Americans a lesson. The Germans really thought they were going to demoralize the Americans. Little did they know they were going up against Yankees. So this was the chateau in Seicheprey when we got there. This is what it looked like after the battle. It's now rebuilt and is a beautiful wedding venue. This is the town. The town was completely destroyed. There was nothing left. There was nothing. When the town was rebuilt years later, they actually rebuilt it on a different footprint, which was unusual. And this is where we were. So in this town, the Germans finally got into the town, and even the cook joined the battle. The cook of, I think it was Company C, out with his cleaver, joining the battle. And there's a great painting at the West Haven Veterans Museum of the Battle of Seicheprey, and it actually shows the cook. We fought, it was hand-to-hand combat at this point, and we fought them off, and they withdrew to their own lines. We wanted to do a counteroffense, but because of all of the lack of the communications lines being cut and some lack of other communications, we didn't. We lost 81 men that morning. There were, I think, 400 wounded and about 289 captured. The Germans took two different photos, one of the American prisoners being marched up a road, and another that was taken in front of a building in Thiaucourt as propaganda, to show that, hey, look at, we got the Americans. However, they didn't. So some estimates say we killed 600 Germans. Von Gallwitz, who was one of the German generals, actually remarked in his later letters that he was surprised at how well the Americans fought. These are our Connecticut guys. These go back to all of that training, all of that marching they did in Nogales, Arizona. We fought hard. Here in Connecticut, actually all over the country, Seicheprey was hailed as the first battle. And look at what we did to the Germans. But we forgot about it because General Pershing considered it a failure because he didn't like General Edwards. It's only been in the last 10 years that people have started talking about Seicheprey again because it was something important to the state. We celebrated Seicheprey Day every year until the 1970s when the last of the veterans started dying off. We started celebrating it again a few years ago. My post in New Haven was doing Seicheprey Day dinners. And I got to spend Seicheprey Day 2018 in the village, which was just like dream of a lifetime. So this is what the trenches in Seicheprey were like when we got there. And that's what they're like today. You go into the Bois de Remière, which is where this trench was, or this was on the edge of it. And it's still, you can still see the trench lines, you can still see the water, and it is considered zone rouge, which means there's so much unexploded ordnance that it's uninhabitable. And one of the times we were there, a chaperone almost tripped into a trench hole onto a 420 millimeter shell, which would have blown her and everyone near her up. All over France in the spring, it's called the Iron Harvest. Farmers go out. One of the farmers in Seicheprey a few years ago blew off his hand. Farmers go out and collect all of the unexploded ordnance from the fields. They put it on the side of the roads, and the ordnance teams come and pick it all up and bring it to detonate it. So Connecticut soldiers served in every single American engagement. This is the medal that they received when they got out, and the clasps that are on it denote what battles you were part of. So coming home, anybody know this guy here? No? So that's Stubby. Stubby is a national hero. He is Connecticut's mascot. He was a dog that was adopted by a New Britain soldier in New Haven in 1917. He was brought over to France. He was wounded at Seicheprey. He had been gassed, so he was able to smell the gas before it came, and he would warn soldiers. The story is he has a blanket, and the story is that the women of Chateau Thierry made that for him because he had warned them of the gas. When he came home, he marched in lots of parades. He is a lifetime member of the American Legion, the Red Cross. He met 3 presidents, marched, had Pershing pin a medal on him, and was the Georgetown Hoya when his human was a student there. When he died in 1926, he was, we're going to call it taxidermied, and his human, Robert Conroy, put him on a cart and wheeled him around. He was the original therapy dog. He would go out into the field to sit with the most wounded soldiers so that they would know, the medics would know where to go. After carting him around for a while, he gave him to the Museum of American History at the Smithsonian, where he still is today. We at the Museum of Connecticut History just got a model of Sergeant Stubby, and we will be unveiling him on March 16th on the 100th anniversary of his death. So you're all welcome to come up that day. I will send some more information about what we're going to be doing. His Robert Conroy's grandson will be there, and we'll do some fun stuff. So Connecticut, after the war, we had these military service records done up. It was a questionnaire. Once again, George Goddard, the state librarian, was ahead of the curve. We're one of 4 states that did these, and ours were the most complete. There were only 4 guys who did it from Bethel, and none of them were very good. Like, they just didn't fill out much information, so I just kept this guy on here. So the first page is just your biographical information. Second is your war record. You know, where were you? Where did you train? How did you get over there? The third is your war record. Were you wounded? What battles were you in? Some guys included a picture. The 4th page is what distinguishes it. This was questions about your experience. One of them, if you took part in the fighting, what impressions were made upon you by the experience? One of the most haunting was a guy from Meriden who said, and I'm paraphrasing, I'm not afraid of death anymore. What I am afraid of is how the news of my death will affect my loved ones back home. So that was something that these guys were thinking about, and something that people back home. You're dealing with all of the work and all of the activities of the war effort, but you're also dealing with the worry you have for your family and friends over there. So these are a really incredible look at the experience of these guys. These are all on Ancestry, if you care to look somebody up. Remembrance. So you guys all recognize this monument, I hope. More than 2,000 men and women from Connecticut gave their lives during World War I. That number has gone up. The official count, I think, had been 1,200, but through all the work that we did during the centenary period, it's up over 2,000. This is the grave of a guy who died on November 11th, 1918. He and Paul Maynard died in the same shell hole an hour before the war ended. They were both from Torrington. Oh, I'm almost out of time. Has anybody ever heard this fantastic story of Henry Bromley? He's a Bethel soldier who made national news. So Henry Bromley actually died in 1918. He was killed in action at Meuse-Argonne. This is his burial card. His body was shipped back home. However, the day that his mother found out he died, she committed suicide. Within an hour, she committed suicide. Fast forward a year, May of 1919, and this guy shows up here in Bethel, and Henry Bromley's aunt looks at him and goes, "Henry, you're alive." And he says, no, I'm not Henry. I'm Sam Reddy. "Henry, you're alive. Come. And so she takes Henry to his father's house, and his father goes, "Henry, wait, you're dead." Hence the story of Henry Bromley and Sam Reddy. This made national news. It was in every paper across the country by November or October, November of 1919. So Henry Bromley's family had been collecting the war risk insurance. So when Henry Bromley suddenly came back to life, the war risk insurance agent came poking and saying, wait a minute. And suddenly there were questions. Is this really Henry Bromley? Well, apparently this dog right there, who had been Henry Bromley's dog, was very vicious, but jumped up into Sam Reddy's arms. Sam Reddy's father and two younger siblings believed him to be Henry Bromley. However, when he went to New Canaan, where Sam Reddy was from, everyone there said, "No, that's Sam Reddy." Apparently, these two guys looked so much alike that their parents couldn't tell them apart. It did end up being Sam Reddy, who had never even served. He made up some stories about how he became Henry Bromley. He ended up going to jail because he had stolen somebody's clothes. Why he did that, I don't know. But it made national news for about a month in 1919. And I found that. I was like, I have to share this. So that's a puzzle for you guys to dig more. One last little, in 2019, I took a group of Connecticut high school students from across the state back to Seicheprey, where we restored about 150 feet of trench line that Connecticut soldiers had fought from. And this is our Connecticut group in front of the fountain that in 1922, the people of Connecticut raised $5,000 for the town of Seicheprey to help rebuild the water supply and erect this fountain. So it's our little tie to France, and they have never, ever forgotten what we did for them. And this is the group with the French students in the trench, which was just a life-changing experience for these kids. So that's it. I am way over. I could keep talking, and thank you guys for being such a great audience. Does anybody have any questions? Or you guys just really want to get out of here? Yes.
You did mention before the war, the Connecticut tended to be more on the side because there was a lot of reluctance to get in the war. Lots of parts of the country, but Connecticut tended to lead probably because it's heavily English ancestry back then. Now so many Germans in Connecticut as opposed to the Midwest.
Yes, we did have a ton of Germans here. We had a very huge, large immigrant, not like the Midwest. Now, and I think our manufacturing base really prepared us to be part of the preparedness movement. And again, looking at the ties between the revolution and today, I think we've always just kind of had that mindset. We were well prepared for the revolution. So it's not surprising that we were on the preparedness side. It also didn't hurt that Teddy Roosevelt had a lot of ties here in the state. His sister lived in Farmington. His niece lived in Avon. He came here a lot. You know, he didn't influence our preparedness, but he definitely helped the messaging. Well, thank you guys for being such a great audience. I hope you enjoyed it. I love this, so thanks. And yes, you can contact me later if you have any questions. It is in the State Library building. So the State Library shares a space with the Supreme Court, which is right across the street from the Capitol. So yes, Hartford, yep. We are not the the Connecticut Museum of Culture and History, which is the old Connecticut Historical Society. We are very similarly named. We are the official state museum. Yeah, right up the street. Yep. Okay. Well, thanks. Henry Bromley?
Yeah.
No, I don't think so. I think he just rolled with it. Once somebody thought he was Henry Bromley, I think he just kind of said, okay, I'm Henry Bromley. There are accounts that he wasn't very smart, that he was a little slower. However, I don't, I think that's probably just the same kind of negativity that they gave to anyone who didn't fit a particular, Miss Mary Hart, they made all sorts of insults about her because, she was a woman and she was older. So of course, but yeah, I think Sam Reddy just kind of fell into it and started going along with it and didn't know how to get out of it until he got caught, and then he confessed everything. So, yeah. Thank you guys.